The HFY had arrived on Earth with the confidence of a conqueror and the arrogance of a species that had never known defeat. Their sleek warships descended from the sky like falling stars, their weapons primed for battle, and their troops eager for blood. They had studied humanity from afar, thinking them weak, and divided a species that could barely unite under a single banner, and they saw themselves as gods among ants. The HFY generals laughed at the stories they had heard from their scouts about human warriors who had somehow managed to fight back against invaders in the past. To them, these tales seemed like nothing more than the desperate ramblings of a primitive race trying to glorify itself. But as their ships touched down on the soil of Earth, they were eager to prove the myths wrong, to show the galaxy that humans were nothing more than a fleeting nuisance standing between them and the galaxy's riches. Their General Vec stood at the helm of the landing force with a scowl on his face. He was a towering figure, his scales gleaming in the sunlight, his armored plating the symbol of the HFY's dominance. Over all who stood before them, his soldiers were ready for battle, and he was determined to crush this insignificant planet's resistance with little more than a show of force. As they disembarked from their ships, their weapons raised high and their boots hitting the Earth's surface in unison, Vec addressed his soldiers with a voice full of disdain. He mocked the human myths, calling them nothing but distractions from the reality of war. He made it clear that their task would be simple: to eradicate any opposition and show the humans the true meaning of power. But as the first human soldiers came into view, Vec and his soldiers began to realize something unexpected. The humans did not run in fear, as the HFY had expected, nor did they cower in submission. Instead, they met the alien invaders with a boldness that was both surprising and unnerving. Small groups of soldiers, led by a human captain named Nate Briggs, moved quickly and decisively, striking from the shadows with a determination that caught the HFY off guard. They didn't have advanced weapons like the HFY or shields to protect them, but what they lacked in technology they more than made up for in sheer will to fight. The HFY were initially confused. Their advanced tactics and weaponry should have made short work of these humans, yet the enemy was more than a mere nuisance. It was as if they had anticipated every move. Vec scowled as his soldiers struggled to gain ground. Their superior firepower had been nullified by the humans' guerrilla tactics and quick thinking. The human soldiers used the terrain to their advantage, striking from hidden positions and retreating into the forests before the HFY could respond. Their attacks were precise and deadly, each strike weakening the HFY forces just enough to force them to reconsider their approach. The battle was chaotic, with both sides clashing violently, yet despite their superior numbers and firepower, the HFY were losing ground at every turn. Vec could not understand how this was happening. These humans had no advanced tech, no weapons that could match the destructive power of his own army, yet here they were taking down squads of HFY soldiers one by one with surprising ease. The longer the battle raged on, the more it became clear to him this was no mere fluke. Something far deeper was at play here, and Vec was determined to uncover what it was. As the day wore on, the HFY were forced to retreat, their morale shattered by the unexpected resistance. The human soldiers had shown Vec could not believe what he had witnessed. A handful of humans had held off his entire force long enough to turn the tide of the battle and make them retreat. He had expected to find nothing but easy targets, but what he had found instead was something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. The humans were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something far greater, something that even the might of the HFY could not easily crush. As the days passed, word spread among the HFY soldiers about the human warrior who had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, a soldier who could defy logic and survive against overwhelming odds. It was impossible. The stories of him became more exaggerated as the weeks went on. Some claimed he was a ghost who moved between shadows. Others said he could take on entire squads single-handedly with no more than a knife and his wits, while others spoke of him as a god who could not be killed no matter what was thrown at him. Vec scoffed at these tales. He could not believe that such a thing was possible. Surely the humans were just getting lucky. But with every new skirmish, reports came in of this mysterious soldier and his uncanny ability to turn the tide of battle. Each time the HFY thought they had him cornered, he escaped, or fought his way out. Vex's irritation grew as the days went on. His soldiers began to whisper about the human warrior with a mix of fear and awe, and it began to gnaw at him. Then came the night that would change everything. The HFY had launched a heavy assault on a small human encampment on the edge of a vast desert. Vex believed this would be their final push to crush the human resistance once and for all. They would show the humans that no one could stand against the might of the HFY, and that the human myths would be put to rest. But as they moved in, the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance, and Vex's forces were met not by an army but by one man standing alone in the middle of the battlefield. Nate Briggs stood in the open like he had no fear of the HFY forces around him, his back straight, his eyes burning with the resolve of a warrior who had nothing left to lose. Vex watched from a distance as the battle began, and to his shock, Nate moved with speed and precision beyond anything he had expected. The man fought as if he could anticipate every move the HFY made. He used the terrain to his advantage, ducking behind rocks and structures, taking shots from impossible angles with deadly accuracy. And when the HFY attempted to close in, he fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Every strike meant to kill, every step calculated to escape. Just as Vex's soldiers began to regroup, they were caught off guard again. Nate had already moved into their ranks. He didn't wait for the right moment, he made it himself. The HFY soldiers were confused and desperate. They couldn't understand how this one human was able to dismantle their carefully laid plans. The alien forces fought back with everything they had, but the human was everywhere at once. His attacks seemed to come from every direction, and he wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to win. Nate managed to take out an entire squadron of HFY soldiers with nothing but the weapons he carried and the will to see his people survive. When the smoke cleared, the battlefield was littered with the bodies of HFY warriors, and Nate Briggs stood victorious. But he didn't linger to admire his work. He disappeared into the shadows just as quickly as he had arrived. Vex stood there on the edge of the battlefield, watching the aftermath with growing disbelief. What had just happened? This wasn't just a lucky break or a fluke. This human had taken down some of his most elite soldiers without breaking a sweat, and it wasn't the first time this was happening. The rumors were true. Nate Briggs was real, and he was far more dangerous than Vex had ever imagined. Vex clenched his fists in frustration. This was no longer just about conquering a planet. This was about destroying a legend, and he would stop at nothing to do so. But the question remained, how could one human soldier stand against an entire army, and why was he doing it? The realization hit Vex like a thunderclap. The human warrior Nate Briggs was no ordinary soldier. He was something entirely different, a living nightmare for the HFY. Their strategy had been built around overwhelming firepower and advanced tactics. But Nate had shown time and time again that he was more than capable of adapting to every challenge he faced, no matter how impossible the odds. The rumors that had been swirling among the soldiers were true, and Vex could no longer dismiss them as just exaggerated tales. Something about Nate had struck fear into the heart of his forces in a way that nothing else had ever done before. Vex's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it. How was this human able to outmaneuver his highly trained soldiers? How was he able to infiltrate their strongholds and turn their technology against them in ways that defied logic? The more Vex thought about it, the more he came to a terrifying conclusion. Perhaps it wasn't just his combat skills that made Nate so dangerous. It was his mind, his ability to think like a predator, to anticipate every move, to stay one step ahead of his enemies without relying on advanced technology or overwhelming force. The HFY were used to battling with sheer might. They didn't understand the concept of fighting with strategy and cunning, not like humans did, and this gap was what made Nate such a formidable foe. Meanwhile, the HFY forces began to lose confidence in their own superiority. Their soldiers began to whisper among themselves about the human warrior. Some were terrified, some were in awe, but none could deny that they had underestimated the human resolve. They had assumed that the human soldiers would fall apart under pressure, that they would give in at the sight of superior firepower. But instead, the humans had rallied around Nate. His leadership, his example of never giving up, had become their greatest strength. As the HFY's own morale began to falter, so too did their grip on control over the planet. Vec called for an emergency meeting with his top officers. His frustration was palpable, and his patience was wearing thin. He demanded answers. How had Nate Briggs become such a thorn in their side? One of his lieutenants suggested that perhaps the humans had some form of hidden weapon, some technology that the HFY had missed, something capable of turning the tide of battle in their favor. Vec didn't want to believe it, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that perhaps the humans had managed to tap into something they had never expected, something beyond weapons and technology. Perhaps the true power of humanity lay in their unrelenting spirit, in their ability to fight and to adapt in the face of overwhelming adversity. Vec's officers continued to debate the issue with no clear answer in sight. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear to Vec. His original assumptions about humanity had been gravely mistaken. The humans were not weak. They were not defenseless. They were a species capable of incredible resilience and innovation, and this would be their undoing if Vec did not act quickly. Vec knew he could not afford to take this threat lightly any longer. The human resistance, led by Nate Briggs, had become a symbol of defiance, something that was spreading like wildfire through the galaxy. With every battle they fought, the legend of the human warrior grew stronger, and Vec could no longer ignore the impact it was having on his forces. He had to put an end to it once and for all, and to do that he would need to capture or eliminate Nate Briggs. The HFY were growing desperate, and in their desperation Vec made a bold decision. He ordered a series of coordinated traps to capture or kill Nate Briggs. They would use everything at their disposal to lure him into a situation he couldn't escape from. Vec believed he knew the human psyche well enough to predict how he would act, and with this knowledge the general set the perfect bait. He would lead Nate into a remote outpost, a place where no reinforcements could reach him, and where the HFY could cut off all escape routes. The trap was set, and it was flawless, or so they thought. As the HFY prepared their ambush, they began to hear the stories again, rumors of Nate's uncanny ability to predict the unexpected, to outthink his enemies with a mind sharper than any weapon the HFY had ever encountered. Their soldiers grew uneasy. Some questioned if it was even possible to defeat a human like Nate, who could seemingly turn the tide of battle with nothing but his instincts and his will to survive. Vec brushed off their concerns. He was certain this time would be different. Nate couldn't escape this carefully orchestrated trap the HFY had laid for him would be his undoing. The day of the ambush arrived, and the HFY forces moved in with precision. The trap was sprung as Nate walked right into their carefully laid web. His team was forced to fight back, and as expected, the HFY surrounded them. They thought victory was within their grasp, but as the battle raged on, something strange began to happen. Nate was not fighting as they had anticipated. He wasn't rushing in blindly to defend his position or retreating as the HFY had expected. Instead, he seemed to be orchestrating chaos around them. Every move was calculated, every step seemed to anticipate the HFY's next one. The humans weren't reacting to the trap, they were turning it into their advantage. Vec watched in disbelief as Nate began dismantling the HFY's plans one by one with eerie precision, using their own tactics against them. Nate's group had spread out, taking hidden positions in the terrain, while his team moved in with surgical accuracy. The HFY soldiers struggled to maintain order as Nate's guerrilla tactics systematically disrupted their lines. The outpost that should have been their victory became their downfall. The once confident HFY soldiers were now on the defensive, retreating as Nate and his team slowly closed in and took them down one by one. The ambush had backfired horribly. At the heart of the chaos, Nate fought like a force of nature, never pausing to catch his breath, his mind working faster than any machine as he adapted to every new threat that the HFY threw at him. The human soldiers had become a well-oiled machine under his leadership. They knew exactly how to work together to overcome every obstacle thrown in their path, and as the day went on, more and more HFY soldiers fell, their numbers thinning rapidly as Nate's strategy played out perfectly. Vec's mind raced. He had seen everything crumble before his eyes. This was not just some lucky escape. This was a pattern that was unfolding time and time again. Every time the HFY thought they had Nate cornered, he escaped, and every time he escaped, he struck back harder. This was no accident. This was no fluke. Nate was outsmarting them at every turn, And it wasn't just his skill, it was his ability to control the battlefield with nothing but his mind. And the will to win. The HFY forces were crumbling under the pressure, and Vec realized that this battle was no longer just about defeating a single human soldier. It was about confronting an entire species' ability to resist and adapt against forces far stronger than themselves. Vec stood on the edge of the battlefield, staring at the aftermath of what should have been a decisive victory for the HFY. The soldiers that remained were confused, shaken by the defeat they had just suffered. They had expected to crush the human resistance, but instead they were retreating, and retreating fast. Nate Briggs had once again turned their plans to dust, and the general could feel his grip on the situation slipping despite his superior technology and weaponry. It was clear that this human soldier had something far more dangerous than anything the HFY had brought to the fight, something that no army could prepare for. It wasn't just Nate's tactics or his will to survive, it was the unexplainable way in which he seemed to anticipate their every move, as though he had already seen the future. Vec ordered a regroup and demanded a strategy meeting with his officers. They needed to find a way to stop Nate once and for all. It was no longer about simply winning the war, it was about stopping the human legend from spreading any further across the galaxy. This human warrior had already become a symbol of defiance among the other human colonies, and the HFY could not allow that to happen any longer. There was something about Nate that was inspiring others to rise up against the HFY, and it was threatening to turn the tide of the entire war. His officers gathered in the war room, their faces grim and their eyes filled with uncertainty. No one had ever faced a challenge like this before. The idea that one human could be so disruptive to a highly advanced military force like the HFY was something none of them could have ever anticipated, but Vec was determined to end it, and end it now. His officers proposed a number of strategies to finally capture or kill Nate Briggs. Some suggested setting a trap, even more elaborate than before. Others wanted to bring in specialized hunters from other planets in the galaxy to track down the human and eliminate him, but Vec was not satisfied with any of these plans. They had already tried all of those approaches and failed every time. No, this time he needed to take a different approach. He needed to find out what made Nate Briggs tick, what drove him to fight so fiercely, and what made him so unpredictable in battle. In a rare moment of silence, Vec turned to his intelligence officer Zera, a highly skilled tactician who had been studying the human resistance for weeks now. She had gathered extensive data on Nate Briggs and his behavior patterns, and she believed she had uncovered something important, something that could give them the edge they needed. Zera approached the table, her voice low but steady. "We've underestimated them," she said to the room. "It's not just about technology or weaponry, it's about their spirit, their willingness to sacrifice everything for their survival. They fight, not because they have to, but because they believe in something greater than themselves. And they follow this human because he has something that the HFY cannot understand, a sense of purpose beyond victory or defeat." Vec listened intently, the words resonating in his mind. He had never considered that perhaps the key to defeating Nate wasn't just in destroying him physically, it was in understanding the very heart of what made him a threat. Zera continued to explain how Nate's leadership wasn't based on fear or obedience, but on the belief that humanity could overcome any obstacle by uniting and fighting for a greater cause. The very idea was foreign to the HFY, who believed in strength above all else, but now it seemed clear to Vec that the true weapon of humanity wasn't their weapons or their military might, it was their unbreakable will to survive, to stand up against overwhelming forces without surrendering. Vec stood silent for a moment as the realization dawned on him. The war was no longer just about technology or firepower. It was about a different kind of power, a power he had never fully understood. And he knew now that to defeat Nate Briggs, he would need to destroy not just the man, but the very idea that he represented. Vec paced in the war room, his mind racing with the implications of what Zera had said, the idea that the key to defeating Nate Briggs was not in technology or firepower, but in breaking the human spirit, was something he had never truly considered before. It was a concept that the HFY found difficult to comprehend. After all, they were a species built on strength and dominance. Their entire culture revolved around the idea that power was the ultimate tool for survival and success. But now it seemed that Nate's greatest weapon was something entirely different, and far more insidious. His power came from his belief in something bigger than himself, something that no amount of weapons or technology could ever replace. Vec's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp voice from his Lieutenant Varrock, who had been scanning the reports on the battlefield. "We've been wrong," he said, his tone urgent. "The human resistance is more than just Nate Briggs. We've been focusing too much on him. But there's something bigger happening. Their leadership isn't just one man, it's a movement. The soldiers under Nate's command are not just following orders, they're following a vision. And that vision is spreading rapidly across the planet. It's inspiring others to join the fight. They've been rallying people from all over, even from behind enemy lines." Vec's eyes narrowed as he processed this new information. It was worse than he had imagined. It wasn't just Nate Briggs that was causing the disruption. It was the very idea that Nate represented a human belief that was spreading like wildfire through the ranks of every resistance group across Earth. The HFY were not just fighting a rebellion, they were fighting a revolution. And the longer they waited, the more entrenched the human resistance became. Each victory by Nate and his soldiers inspired more and more people to rise up against their invaders, and Vec knew that if this movement wasn't stopped soon, it would snowball into something far bigger than he could ever control. "We need to sever the heart of this rebellion," Vec said, his voice low and determined. "We need to make the humans believe that their leader is not invincible, that Nate Briggs can be destroyed. If we take him out once and for all, we can break their spirit. We can make them question everything they've been fighting for." Zara nodded in agreement, but there was a hesitation in her eyes. She knew that if Nate was truly the symbol of human resistance, then taking him out would have consequences that went far beyond just a tactical advantage. It could destroy the very thing that made humans so dangerous: their belief in their own ability to rise above and fight back, no matter the odds. Vec turned to his officers, his gaze hardening. "We've underestimated them for too long. We've treated them like an inferior species, with no true understanding of what they're capable of. But now it's clear they're not like us. They fight for a cause, they fight for each other, and they fight with everything they have. They have something that we don't, and we're going to take it from them before it's too late." The plan was set. The HFY would launch a final assault on the human stronghold, where they believed Nate Briggs was hiding. They would overwhelm the resistance with their superior numbers and strike quickly, taking Nate out in a surgical attack that would leave no room for escape. Vec felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him, but he knew it was the only way to end the war once and for all. As the HFY forces mobilized for the final push, Vec couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The human resistance had been able to survive this long because of their unity and their will to fight back. But now it seemed they were fighting for more than just survival. They were fighting for something that Vec still couldn't fully understand, and he couldn't help but wonder if this would be their undoing, or if humanity would prove once again that they were more than just a force to be reckoned with. They were a force that could change the course of history. The final assault was set into motion. The HFY forces moved with precision. Every unit was ready and every soldier was prepared for what they thought would be the end of the human resistance. Vec had given strict orders for the target to be neutralized with ruthless efficiency. They would leave nothing to chance and show the humans that their leader, their hero, was nothing more than a false hope, a myth that would be shattered forever. The final battle would take place at the heart of the human stronghold, a place where Nate Briggs and his forces had been able to hold out despite the overwhelming odds they had faced so far. Vec believed that the human leader was hiding there, his last line of defense, and the HFY were determined to crush it. As the HFY forces advanced on the stronghold, the atmosphere grew tense. The ground seemed to vibrate under the weight of their war machines, and the air was thick with anticipation. Every soldier knew the importance of this moment. This would be the turning point, the battle that would end everything and prove once and for all that the HFY were invincible. Nate Briggs would fall, and the humans would finally understand their place in the galaxy. But as the HFY moved closer to the stronghold, something unexpected happened. The human forces did not retreat, nor did they panic. Instead, they stood their ground, and as the HFY approached the final line of defense, they encountered an eerie silence. The once chaotic sounds of battle seemed to vanish, replaced by the heavy breathing of soldiers waiting for the inevitable. Vec couldn't understand it. It was as if the humans were prepared for their doom, And yet there was something more about the stillness of the scene. It was a feeling that struck fear into the hearts of even the most battle-hardened HFY soldiers. At the heart of the stronghold, Nate Briggs was standing alone in the middle of the battlefield. The shadows of the HFY war machines loomed over him. But he didn't move, he didn't flinch, he stood there with his back straight, his eyes locked on the approaching enemy as if he knew what was coming, and was ready to face it head-on. This was not the reaction Vec had expected from the human leader. The man should have been desperate, scrambling for a way out. Instead, he stood tall as though his mission was already complete, as though he had already won something beyond this war. Vec ordered his forces to advance, but there was hesitation in his command. It was as if Nate's presence had somehow taken the air out of the entire operation. The HFY soldiers were still focused on the task ahead, but many of them couldn't help but glance at their leader standing alone in the face of certain death with a calm that was unnerving in its certainty. It made the HFY doubt everything they thought they knew about the humans and about this war. The assault began, but Nate didn't retreat. He didn't even seem to move. He simply watched as the HFY charged forward. But then something else happened. One by one, the human soldiers emerged from the shadows, their faces grim and determined. They had been waiting for this moment for too long. They had been pushed into a corner, and they were ready to fight for everything they had ever believed in. The HFY were not fighting an enemy of weaklings and cowards. They were fighting a people who were ready to die for each other, for their world, and for their future. Vec's mind raced as the human forces surged forward. They were everywhere, coming from every direction, from tunnels, from hidden positions, and from beneath the very ground itself. The HFY were being overwhelmed by an unseen force, as though they had walked into a trap of their own making. Nate Briggs had known they would come, and he had turned their own strength against them. With a strategy so simple and so effective, it seemed almost impossible. The HFY had underestimated the humans yet again, and now they were paying the price. The battle raged on with a fury that Vec had not anticipated. The HFY forces were being overwhelmed from all sides as the humans unleashed everything they had left: their fury, their desperation, and their unyielding will to survive. The once confident HFY soldiers were faltering in the face of such tenacity. Nate Briggs stood at the heart of it all, never wavering, never hesitating, his presence like a rallying cry for every soldier around him. It was clear now that this wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a fight for the soul of humanity. And in that moment the HFY could feel it. This was the power they had been up against all along, and it wasn't one they could defeat with sheer strength. Vec was at the forefront of the command center, watching the chaos unfold on the screens, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair with white-knuckled intensity. He had made every effort to anticipate this battle, but now the humans were in control. He watched helplessly as his forces retreated, being picked apart by a force that shouldn't have been capable of such resistance. The sheer coordination of the human soldiers was something no one had ever predicted, and no one had been prepared for. The HFY relied on superior technology and overwhelming force, but the humans fought with something far more dangerous, something that no amount of weapons could counter. Vec's voice crackled over the comms as he issued orders to his remaining forces, his words filled with a cold determination. But even as he barked commands, there was a growing doubt in his mind, a realization that perhaps this battle was already lost. The more he watched the tide of the battle turn in the humans' favor, the more he understood that this wasn't just about taking a planet anymore. It was about something deeper, something the HFY had never understood until now. The humans were not fighting for land or resources. They were fighting for their right to exist, for their freedom to choose their future, and Nate Briggs had become the symbol of that fight. He had embodied the very essence of what it meant to never give up, no matter how impossible the odds, and in doing so he had inspired every human soldier under his command to fight with everything they had. Every person in that battle knew what was at stake, and they weren't about to let it slip away. On the battlefield, Nate Briggs was everywhere. He was not just a soldier, he was a force of nature. The HFY had thought him to be just one man, but they had been wrong. They had underestimated the power of a single human, and what he could achieve when he stood for something greater than himself. Nate's presence on the field was like a storm breaking over the HFY forces. With every move he seemed to tear apart the very fabric of their strategy. His leadership was unmatched, and his ability to adapt to every situation only made him more formidable. As the battle wore on, it became clear that the HFY were no longer in control. Vec had no more options left. His forces were in disarray, and his plans had failed. The humans were not only resisting but winning, and it was not by brute force, but by sheer willpower and unity that they had turned the tide. It was something Vec couldn't understand, and he couldn't accept. He had thought the HFY were unbeatable, but now he knew that they were not invincible, and humanity was proving it every second. As the final blow came, Nate Briggs emerged from the chaos, standing tall as the last HFY forces retreated into the distance. He had done it. He had led his people to victory, and he had shattered the myth that the HFY were invincible. The human resistance had won, and in that victory Nate's legend was sealed. He had become more than a man. He had become a symbol of everything humanity stood for: their strength, their resilience, their unwavering belief that no force in the universe could break them. And with that victory, the HFY learned a painful lesson they would never forget. Humanity was not to be underestimated, and Nate Briggs was no myth, but a warrior who had proven that a single human could indeed change the course of history.